Here, say it's time to give Miss Chris Weicker our attention. She's a great friend of the Francis Marion Symposium. Not this box, Miss Weicker. Y'all, seriously, in the back. We have plenty of time during lunch to talk, y'all, I promise. But you have to sit down now so we can have a long time for lunch. Francis and I welcome you back. Christine is going, first of all, she has books in the back, don't forget that. Second of all, she's talking about a topic that is near and dear to my heart, being a Georgian from the penal colony of the West, is Elijah Clarke, who is actually going to play into a program this afternoon by Mike Burgess. And without further ado, let's welcome Christine.
Thank you. I'm from Spartanburg, and the hurricane did not treat us kindly. So we don't have any internet, except sporadically. And that meant that I couldn't write files and couldn't write my presentation. And then the computer won't talk to the printer. So after all of the high-tech material that you've been seeing, we're back to the old-fashioned way. Elijah Clarke, and the title is Almost Fatally Courageous. That's a term that Robert Scott Davis used for him, and I think it's appropriate. Now, Elijah Clarke was born in 1733 in North Carolina, and his father had a land grant at Grindle's Shoals, and Elijah came down to that area and moved onto that property. It is believed that he is the first white settler in that part of the world, which happens to be just close to Spartanburg. Now, he didn't stay there a tremendously long time, but he was a hunter and an excellent shot, and he made a living trapping and trading in furs. So he went back to North Carolina for a time, and we really don't know much about him until he was about 42 years old. And at that point, Georgia had opened up land for, and wanted new landowners, small landowners, to move into what they called the ceded land. Now, traders had cheated the Indians, and the Indians had acquired a tremendous debt. And the government said, well, we'll pay your debt for land. And the chiefs agreed, and the ceded land included 2,100,000 acres. That must have been some debt. Anyway, it was in two parcels. Now, one of the parcels was between the Ogeechee and the Altahama rivers, and that was a small parcel. The largest parcel was Wilkes County, and that went from Augusta west and north, and would cover most of North Georgia, the present-day North Georgia. Now, they wanted a lot of small landowners because they needed militia to fight the Indians. Because although the chiefs had agreed, a lot of the Indians did not like these new settlers. And Elijah got 200 acres for himself, and 25 acres for his wife Hannah, and 25 acres for all of his children. And he moved into a creek, on a creek, and of course he called it Clarke's Creek. he built a substantial log cabin, a huge stockade to protect himself and his children and wife and his neighbors. And of course, he called it Clarke's Fort. He was not a real humble man. I should mention here, he was totally illiterate. And toward the end of his life, he would dictate directives and sign it with a very shaky C. That was the extent of his literacy. Now, Wilkes County did acquire a huge militia, and the militia leaders were John Dooley and Elijah Clarke. And they were both Indian fighters, and they had cooperated very well and got along extremely well. Now, the British occupied the coastal area, and the British officer, Campbell, had the idea that if British officers showed up, that British supporters would just rush to their militia. So he sent British officers north from Augusta. Now, one of them was Lieutenant Colonel Boyd, and he expected Boyd to recruit about 6,000 local loyalists. Now, Clarke went north along the Savannah River, and then he moved over into South Carolina, which put him in the Long Cane district, and that belonged to Andrew Pickens. And Pickens did not take that well, so there were skirmishes along that border until finally Lieutenant Colonel Boyd was pushed back. Now, he was running out of food, had run out of food. The weather was miserable. His men were miserable. He had failed his assignment. So he stopped at a farm and commandeered all of their cattle to feed his men, and then started looking for a camping place to accomplish this. And he found it below a high hill, along a creek, and where there was a lot of forage for the horses, so they let the horses go, and set about building fires and preparing to butcher the beef and have a meal. They did not know that Andrew Pickens, John Dooley, Elijah Clarke, and James McCall were all following him. Now, when the battle was planned, Andrew Pickens was the boss. And he had everything laid out, and he was very, very precise in his directions, as he always tended to be. And Dooley was to stay on the right, and then Pickens and McCall would come up over the hill, and Elijah Clarke was supposed to be on the left and was to attack on the left. Well, Boyd had hunkered down below the hill, and he heard firing, so he went up to the top of the hill and was hit with 3 shots and mortally wounded. The Dooley got in trouble because he encountered a swamp. That didn't work, so he was late. And then Elijah Clarke saw that there were British on the other side of the creek, so instead of attacking on the left, he started over the creek. His horse was shot underneath him, but he grabbed another one, and with about 24 of his men following, he attacked Major Spurgeon on the other side and scattered them. The Spurgeon left, and with everybody that survived, and went back to toward Augusta. Now, the battle had gone well, and it was a very significant victory, but Pickens was not happy. He didn't like Dooley, and he didn't like Clarke. He respected their fighting ability, but they wouldn't take orders. And although they would fight many times together, Andrew Pickens never approved of Elijah Clarke. I don't think it bothered Elijah much. I don't think he had a thin skin. Now, the significance of this battle was not lost on Campbell. He realized that British officers or not, the back country did not have many British supporters. Now, the British at this time sort of hunkered down, but there were several attempts to push them out of Georgia, and the militia was involved and had a series of defeats because they finally had to admit that they could not push the British out of Georgia. They didn't have enough power, but they could control the backcountry, and they certainly would do that. Now, this was a very little battle on a remote place, but it made a difference in the attitude of the British. Now, the French and Americans joined to attack Savannah and that field, and of course, Francis Marion was not in that battle. Now, the opposing Tories just, and assisted by some British troops, attacked in the ceded lands, and many other militia leaders, along with Dooley and Clarke, were targeted. Now, the war was a stalemate in the North at this time, and we now will have what we call the Southern Campaign, and the British called their Southern Strategy. And the British attacked Charleston, which fell May the 12th in 1780. 3,000 Continental troops were taken prisoner and usually held in prison ships, and many of them died. Now, the militia could take a parole, and Andrew Pickens did. So did John Dooley. Elijah Clarke did not. That wasn't it, just wasn't in his character. Now, the British honored Pickens and treated him well on parole because they always hoped that he would eventually turn and support the British, because they recognized that he was a man of tremendous influence in the backcountry. But parole did not save Dooley. They murdered him. And Elijah Clarke was still loose. Now, the British, Clinton, established the outpost. We all know where they were around here in 96 and Augusta. And the Patriot militia decided that they needed leadership under and combined the militia. And in the Carolinas, McDowell, Charles McDowell, was the leader. And in Georgia, with Dooley dead, Elijah Clarke emerges as the Wilkes County militia leader. Now, I know that there are many militia leaders in Georgia. But because this is about Elijah Clarke, I'm going to sort of confine myself to the events in which he was featured. Now, in July of 1780, Captain John James Jones and 35 militia came from Burke County, Georgia, and were headed for Colonel McDowell's camp at Earl's Ford. Now, they were going to have to pass through Tory areas, so they pretended to be Tories and told people that they were headed for 96. But they soon encountered Gowan's Ford. And that was in, or is, in North Greenville County. And at that fort, there were provincials inside. So all pretense of them being Tories was gone, and they attacked and took the prisoners, and they didn't have any way to deal with them, so they sent them down the road on parole. Now previously, provincials under the command of Captain Dunlap had planned a surprise attack on militia at Cedar Springs, militia under the command of John Thomas. And you all probably have heard the story of Jane Thomas, John's mother, who was at 96 taking care of her real husband, who was a prisoner. And she rode about 40 miles in the dark to warn her son. So they took to the woods, built up the fires, and when Dunlap arrived, silhouetted against the firelight, his men were great targets, and many were killed, and a lot scattered. And some of them were the ones that had taken refuge in at Gowan's. So now, Dunlap is still looking for his men, and he encounters these provincials who are walking down the road, headed for 96 to turn themselves in on parole. And I don't think that Dunlap believed in parole, because he collected them and started following the Jones militia. They got to Earl's Ford very, very late at night, and the camp was already down asleep. So they just threw themselves on the ground at the edge of the river, which is the Backlet, and went to sleep. Dunlap came, and thinking that all he had to deal with was a small militia group, attacked with sabers and swords. And 2 were killed, but the camp was aroused, mounted, followed the fleeing Dunlap, and as they rode, they literally chopped down several provincials. Dunlap got to Fort Prince, which is on the edge of Spartanburg, and the militia following him did not know the strength of that fort, so they didn't attack. But they went back, and as they went back through the area where they had fought, they passed the bodies of the dead provincials, and they did not stop to bury them. The attitude now is they are just carcasses. All sense of civility had disappeared at this point. Now Elijah Clarke joined McDowell, and so did John, and found John Jones had 8 saber wounds on his head. Now he lived, but he certainly wasn't going to fight again, so he turned his militia over to Elijah Clarke. Now, not John Severe, but Isaac Shelby decided to join, and he arrived at McDowell's camp. And Isaac Shelby's militia always was called militiamen and riflemen. So I think that's important as we go along because rifles had a tremendous impact on some of the battles. And if Shelby was there, they had a lot of rifle power. Now, the last British post in the upcountry was Fort Anderson. The locals called it Fort Pickney. And on July 30th, the Patriots attacked. And the fort was well stocked, it was well armed, but they surrendered without firing a shot. The rumor has it that when they found out that the Georgians were there, and Elijah Clarke was rather a fearful individual, a ferocious fighter, they decided that they didn't want to take their chances. I don't know if that's true or not, but it sort of makes sense. Now, the British in the backcountry were under the command of Patrick Ferguson, and his subordinate was Dunlap. And Dunlap, of course, had already crashed with the Georgians, and a running battle east of Spartanburg, Clarke and Shelby would stand and fight, retreat for a while, and then local militia would follow. If you're familiar with Spartanburg, this all took place east of 221 on Southport Road. They fought through Wofford's Iron Works and heading toward the Pacolet River. Now, Clarke suffered a wound, a saber wound to his head, and a blow to his neck was deflected by his sword belt that he carried, that he wore around his neck. At one point, two provincials had grabbed him, but he saw that his son was in trouble, so he threw them off and went to help his son, John. Now, eventually, Dunlap was forced to retreat, but he met Ferguson coming up the road, so they turned around and continued the fight until the Patriots were entrenched on the high ground of the Pacolet River, and that was not a great place for the British to attack, so they left. Now, in the battles, and that so far, a lot of British were killed, but a tremendous number were wounded. And they would move those wounded to Musgrove's Mill. Now, McDowell and his combined militia were now at Smithford on the Broad River, close to Gaffney, and he wanted to make another strike before some of his militia, whose time was up, would leave. He decided Musgrove's Mill was an easy target because of his intelligence indicated that the wounded were protected only by 200 Tory militia. So he picked 200 of his militia under three commanders, Isaac Shelby, James Williams, and Elijah Clarke. And the men selected were, quote, picked men well mounted. Now, an aside here, people at that time who considered themselves gentry thought of these back country people as those back settlers or riflemen are parcel of riffraff. That was heard in the South Carolina Assembly. Reverend Woodmason wrote of the Scots-Irish as ignorant, mean, worthless, beggarly, Irish Presbyterians, the scum of the earth, the refuge of mankind. That's high praise. And John Rutledge, the governor of South Carolina, referred to the country folk, or the lower sort, as a pack of beggars, and George Washington, a parcel of barbarians with an uncouth set of people. And the three colonels were white savages, a pack of beggars, a refuge of mankind. That keeps ringing in my mind. Now, leaving Smithport about an hour before sunset, the three then went the roads. Now, Clarke and Shelby might not have known much about that territory, but James Williams did. James Williams had a home on Little River, and he led the Little River Militia. Patrick Ferguson had attacked that home, was using it for headquarters, and Mrs. Williams and the young children had been moved to the outbuildings buildings, and they were virtually under house arrest. Williams knew that territory intimately. Now, they rode 40 miles at night, but when they approached Musgrove's Mill, they were detected, so any element of surprise was deleted, and no thought of retreat. The horses were broke, so they approached the what would become the battle site, and found a wooded bridge overlooking a long and wide clear field down to the Inner River, which was low enough to wade across, and beyond that, the British camp. Now, the Patriots had a conjoined command, and they probably had discussed tactics or so before they went to the line. And it said that someone told them that, told the militia to, every man to take his tree, and they sent a mounted group of from Georgia, Shadrach, Edmund, and a small group of mounted to keep approaching the British and sort of goad them. And Colonel Innes, who was there, finally the Patriots realized that Colonel Innes had come the night before with 150 provincials, so they were now outnumbered more than 2 to 1 and fighting very experienced provincials. So they decided that to take their tree and wait. Now, Ennis, does anybody here remember George Fields? George Fields talks about this battle and the conjoined event. He said that in his experience, this was the only battle that was won by a committee. The Patriots were lined up, Elijah Clarke on the left, Shelby in the middle, and James Williams on the right. And they waited, and finally, Shadrach Edmund had irritated Innes enough, so Innes had his men cross the river and line up. And it is said that the British started firing at 150 yards, which with their muskets was ridiculous, but anyway. The mounted fixed bayonets And Ennis intended to use cold steel to take care of the day, to win the day. Now, a question that Jack Buchanan raised in his new book on Musgrove's Mill, and you might ponder this later sometime, especially the nights when you can't sleep. Why did experienced officers in an open field attack an entrenched militia? Didn't they remember what had happened at Reed's Hill? That takes a lot of thought. While the rebels on the hill waited for the order to fire, it would be a single shot from Isaac Shelby. Now, they held their fire. Again, there were a lot of rifles on that line, and they held their fire until practically you could see the whites of their eyes. It comes from another battle, but it's appropriate here. And the only reason that I can think of is they wanted the British fully involved so that they wouldn't realize the trouble they were in and regroup or withdraw and wait till Ferguson came back, which they were expecting before long, because they didn't start shooting from the militia line until, and it depends, primary sources being what they are, it could have been 50 yards or 40 yards or 30 yards, depending upon who you want to believe. But they did hold their fire until the British were very close. And the first Patriot volley, many British fell. Now, the provincials were straight in the middle and militia on either side, British militia on either side. And the militia were aiming at officers. And the second volley was absolutely disastrous. Colonel Ennis and Major Brazier, who were leading on horseback, were both hit. All of the officers were killed or wounded except 2. And of course, at this point, the British militia just fled, and leaving the provincials on their own. The Patriots left their trees and started after the British Army, shooting them in the back. And it was said that the ground was thick with dead men, and of course those dead men were British. Now, the militia stopped at the Unnery River and then called for their horses to be brought up. And while they were waiting, they got a messenger from McDowell, who told them that Cornwallis had defeated the Continental Army at Camden, and there was no Continental Army left in the South. These men knew that they would now be targeted. And before they left to get back to their homes, they did meet and agreed that if one were threatened, they would all come. They would mass the militia and fight on their terms. And I think that this is the first major victory for the Patriots in South Carolina. Williams would take 70 prisoners to North Carolina and to find the Continental Army and turn them over. There were many dead, many wounded on the British side. However, more than 60 killed and 90 wounded. The Patriots reported only 4 killed. One of them, sadly, was Shadrach Edmund of Georgia. Now, back in Georgia, Clarke attacked his nemesis from the Alligator Creek days, early days, Lieutenant Colonel Brown, that we called Birdfoot Brown. Now, the attack was against Augusta was successful, and Clarke had Brown penned in to the point that they were British had run out of ammunition and food and water, and they were drinking their own urine before a relief group came from 96, and Clarke was forced back. Now, when the Kruger from 96 attacked, he took many Georgians prisoner. They hanged about a dozen of them. They turned other prisoners over to the Indians, who were to be tortured and killed. And Clarke was able to get away with a good many of his militia, but he was very, very disappointed and unhappy. Now, Clarke and his men were now under attack by the British, and he collected his men and their families, and he had a column of 800 people, 300 militia, the rest were family members, wives, children, and old folks. He had to get them out of Georgia, and he was headed for the Watauga community over the mountains, where he knew that Shelby's men and Severe's men would keep their families safe. It would be a trek of 200 miles. They had rations for 5 days. The weather was deteriorating rapidly. It was in the fall. But they started out, and even although the British were looking for them, Clarke took his people in a manner that nobody expected. He stayed in Georgia till he got to the Tupelo area, and then moved into North Carolina. He did not try to cross South Carolina, which is where everybody was looking for him. But he was lost in the snow north of Asheville, and with no way of getting through those mountains. And Holton militia found him, and they had crossed the mountains. They told him about the threat to Shelby and the Over Mountain men, and that they were assembling at Kings Mountain. Now, Clarke was obligated to help Shelby, but he had 800 souls to take care of. They had run out of food, they were eating roots and twigs, and the Holston militia showed him how he could get through the mountains, and that's where he went. But he sent 30 Georgians with him, with the Holstons, to Kings Mountain. Now, the Georgians were under the command of Major William Candler and Captain Stephen Johnson, and they would join Shelby with 30 men. Now, one of them was Captain Patrick Carr. And if you want to read about an exciting militiaman, you should read about Paddy Carr, who boasted that he had killed more Tories than any man alive, and nobody in Georgia ever argued that. Anyway, they made it to Kings Mountain. Ferguson there had vowed that not even the devil himself could move him from that mountain, and he was right, because the militia did. They killed him, and they buried him on that mountain, so he's still there. The aftermath of that, there were a few killed. They sort of had trials, but unfortunately, they soon dispersed. Now, Clarke had reached Watauga, and these people were welcomed. They were taken in and sheltered until the storm of war was over. But the men left their women and children there, and because they had a war to fight. Now, after Kings Mountain, Cornwallis realized that his western flank was exposed. He moved back from Charlotte to Winnsboro. Now, the Continental Army was moving south with Gates in command. But George Washington made a move that would change the war in the South, and he appointed Major General Nathaniel Greene to take over the Continental troops. Now, Greene is described as having a superior mind and a Herculean memory, and he was also a micromanager. As he moved south to take over this new command, he heard about Musgrove's Mill and Kings Mountain. Now, like all professional soldiers, he didn't much like militia, but he saw their value. Now, with the families now safe in Watauga, Clarke and militia joined Thomas Sumter at Blackstocks, and they were part of the group that caught Tarleton in a crossfire. Now, we know that Sumter was badly wounded and removed from the area. Twiggs was in command. He's another Georgian. And 100 British were killed at Blackstocks. But Tarleton, in his book after the war, declared that he was the victor and that he had killed many militia colonels. He lied, as he often did. Now, the Georgians left the Sumter area, and they took their militia back to Long Cane. McCall was there. Now, troops under Brigadier General Daniel Morgan were also in the area. And on the 12th of December, Clarke and his militia was caught between provincials and British militia, and they fought their way out. However, they had a lot of casualties, and among the wounded were both McCall and Elijah Clarke. Now, the British thought that they had killed Clarke. However, they learned later that although he was seriously wounded, he was still alive. And the first stop that they had done, that made, was to McCall's home, and he didn't find McCall and Clarke. that he destroyed everything, leaving Mrs. McCall destitute. And then Dunlap made a mistake which would impact the rest of the war. He knew that Andrew Pickens, James McCall, and Elijah Clarke had fought together before and that they were friends. He believed that Clarke was being hidden at Andrew Pickens' property. And so he attacked Andrew Pickens' property, burned out buildings, terrorized the residents, and didn't find Clarke. But he had violated Andrew Pickens' parole, and Andrew Pickens fell down. He was free to join the fight. And so Morgan was at Grindle Shoals. He had very little militia support because Thomas Sumter wouldn't let his men respond to the commands or the needs of Continentals, which Karen knows all about. Anyway, on Christmas Day, Andrew Pickens and John McCall arrived at Grindle Shoals and offered their services to Daniel Morgan. Now, McCall joined Captain William Washington's cavalry, and with McCall's knowledge of the terrain, they attacked the Tories at Hammond's store with swords and wounded 150 and captured 40 without suffering a single casualty themselves. Lord Cornwallis ordered Tarleton to deal with Morgan, and Pickens called out the militia. Now, both Bobby Moss, Dr. Bobby Moss, and Larry Babbitts can document that there were over 1,000 Patriot militia on the Caulfield battlefield. All they needed was a couple of volleys, shooting down British officers and NCOs, but they were there. Now, everybody, I think, knows what happens at Cowpens, but if you didn't, you should read Larry Babbitt's book, A Devil of a Whipping, because that is the definitive book on that, on that particular battle. Now, Elijah Clarke was still wounded, and he couldn't come, but he sent the Georgia militia, and they were skirmishers on that battlefield. They were under the command of Cunningham. Now, after the battle, when Morgan started what we call the race to the Dan, Andrew Pickens and his long came militia, and the Georgia militia, as well as some others that wanted to go along, moved to assist Morgan's troops on the race to the Dan. And of course they eventually made it, and it was, things were working very well. Pickens did not cross the Dan. He stayed in south of it. But then Leghorst Harry Lee arrived and came back over the Dan and joined Pickens and his militia. And they were involved in what we call piles hacking. And I know that Mike Burgess is going to talk about Leghorst Harry, and so you'll hear more about that. But in a surprise attack, 99 of Pyle's men were killed and 150 wounded. and the Patriot report on casualties was 1 wounded horse. And the 6th of May, Tarleton attacked Colonel Washington at Wetzel's Mill. Light Horse Harry Lee and Mary Pickens Bishop Pickens militia were involved. And although the British casualties exceeded the American casualties, Andrew Pickens was unhappy. In the first place, he is in North Carolina with South Carolina and Georgia militia, and I think he feels that the North Carolina militia ought to be doing some of this work. He complained to Greene and Governor Rutledge. His Georgians had left home before November and had been on the move for 5 months. And Greene and Rutledge agreed with Pickens, and so now Pickens was going home. Now, while the militia was with Pickens, Clarke had finally recovered, and he had James McCall with him, and he went after Dunlap. Now, on the 21st of March, he found him at Beatty's Mill, and ordering his militia to stay beyond the range of the British muskets, Clarke ordered his riflemen to keep up a steady fire. And after 35 or more men were killed or wounded, Dunlap surrendered. Now, it was expected that the prisoners would be sent to Gilbert Town, but Major Dunlap never arrived. And all of a sudden, he's dead. And everybody knew that this was Georgia parole. See, they had the idea, if you take a prisoner and you put him on parole, you're going to have to fight him again, so let's just kill him this time. And they did, and they called it Georgia parole. Andrew Pickens was furious. He knew the Georgians had done it, and he offered a $1,000 reward for anybody who would turn in the perpetrators, and nobody ever did. Now, in defense of the Georgians, other people killed prisoners. Tarleton did, Ferguson did, Burnfoot Brown did, and Kruger at 96 ordered prisoners hanged without a court, with the trial. So the Georgia militia moved back toward the Savannah River, and then many of the men finally came down with smallpox. Elijah Clarke was stricken, and with his wife was always taking care of him, into isolation to wait out the attack. James McCall did also, but James McCall died. When Clarke was ill, his men went back to Wilkes County and were appalled at the conditions. Homes burned, old men hanged, and women and children turned over to the Indians. Now the militia held Burnfoot Brown accountable, and so they moved to Augusta. And at this point, they were joined by Light Horse Harry Lee. And the middle of May, they attacked Augusta. Now, Andrew Pickens was there. He was now a British brigadier general, and he was accompanied by Lee and joined by Clarke. And there were two forts. One, Fort Grierson, which was a fortified fort of a local and prominent Tory, and then Fort Cornwallis. Now, the British laid siege to Fort Cornwallis, and Grierson had moved to Fort Cornwallis, so they were both there. Now, Brown, who was commanding, he refused to surrender, citing the fact that Clarke's rabble was there, and it was beneath his dignity to surrender to Clarke if Clarke was involved. So the Light Horse Harry Lee and the rest built a tower, put a 6-pounder on top of it, and pounded Fort Cornwallis until they surrendered. Now, the prisoners inside that fort included men from the Wilkes County who had been taken a year before. Now, Brown had hanged 18 of them, but those he held hostage were in horrible shape from torture and malnutrition. And Pickens was determined to prevent Brown from being a victim of Georgia parole. So he had Lee's Continentals remove Brown and take him to Savannah under parole. Grierson did not fare as well. They put him in prison, and a mounted rifleman rode by and shot him in prison. And Andrew Pickens knew it was the Georgians, offered another reward, and no one ever claimed it. Now, Clarke continued to fight Indians over a long period of time, and the action continued in the Low Country for quite some time. Nathaniel Greene wanted Clarke to come to Utah Springs with 150 men. Clarke did not respond. His excuse was his men were still suffering from the effects of smallpox, which had just kept going. His horses were in terrible shape, and it was a long journey, and so he didn't go. But there were Georgians at Utah Springs, and they were fighting under the command of Andrew Pickens. Now, eventually, this war ends, and everybody thought that it was all over. Now, Clarke was given the confiscated estate of one of his enemies, Colonel Thomas Waters. Now, although Clarke would continue to fight Indians, he would move on. He was a member of the Georgia legislature representing Wilkes County. And in 1781, he was elected colonel of the Wilkes County Militia, and later a major general. He was admired, respected. He had educated his children. One of them would become governor of Georgia later. Now, what could possibly go wrong? Well, some years, 7 years later, a French minister as a legislative individual, not a clergyman, arrived in America and thought it would be a great idea if the United States and France took British Florida. Well, Clarke was approached, and he was offered a good bit of money, and he would be, $10,000, and be a major general in the French army. Now remember, this man is illiterate. He's smart and he's brave, but he's illiterate. So he thought it was a great idea, a great opportunity, and his militia would have now have territory and homesteads in Florida. And who wouldn't want to live in Florida? So he joined on that. Now, George Washington had no interest in getting involved with another fight with the British. So he squelched that, which meant that Elijah Clarke and his men did not get their Florida estates, and they needed property. So he took the area around the Coney region, and they set up a community. Now, they wrote a constitution. They had a committee of safety. They built 9 forts, and they had a very thriving community. Now, they appealed for legitimacy, evidently, and the courts wavered, the local courts wavered. They went to a higher court. That court wavered as to whether this was a legal community or not. It was called the Trans-Oconee Republic. And eventually, the governor of Georgia, Governor Matthews, who absolutely despised Elijah Clarke, decided that this rabble should not have this community. After all, it was meant for more worthy people, and he ordered an attack on Clarke with state troops. The state troops had been, for the most part, during the war, part of Clarke's militia. And Clarke was not willing to fight. So he left the community, he went back home, and he sort of disappointed and discouraged, and lamenting about how things have changed, and he always wished for the good old days. Anyway, Jack Buchanan said he died in December the 5th, 1799, and, quote, disillusioned, reputation diminished, pursued by creditors unknown today, unquote. Now, he faded into oblivion, and he would be lost for about 150 years. And about 40 years ago, Georgia commissioned a young and I think very brilliant historian to examine the site of the Battle of Kettle Creek. And that historian was Robert Stock Davis. Now, and he is a marvelous researcher. And at some point, Gasser, and that's all caps, G-A-S-S-A-R, and that stands for the Georgia Society of the Sons of the American Revolution. And they heard about his work, and they decided that they would take the preservation of the Kettle Creek project as a project, and they have ever since. Now, every year, on the second weekend of February, Gasser celebrate the Battle of Kettle Creek with a moving ceremony at the site, which is 10 miles from Washington, and expressed their appreciation for the patriots that fell there. They had ceremonies at Washington, the nearest town, and Saturday, Washington turns colonial. And there are costumed people, not just DAR and CAR, but the civilians of Washington are really into this. And they're playing colonial music and colonial dancing, and they're playing colonial games with the children, and it's a great event. And then on Sunday, they have a memorial service at the gravesite of Elijah and Hannah Clarke with all military honors. Over the years, I had the opportunity to go to many of these, and they asked me to write a book about Kettle Creek, which I did, and for that, they gave me a medal, a Martha Washington medal, which even as a Tory, I wear with pride, because I'm very proud of the Georgia Society and what they have done. Now, they continue to invest time and resources on that site. They have bought additional property. They have done state-of-the-art archaeology. They have built a 2-lane road, so to make it accessible. It worked on a visitor center and signage, and they are determined. They're totally committed to continuing spreading the story that we all should know. And the story is Elijah Clarke, almost totally courageous. Thank you. I'm sorry, totally courageous.
Do you have any quick questions for Christine? And if not, you can always ambush her at lunch. She enjoys that immensely. And her books are in the back. And interestingly enough, while we were sitting here, Valley and I were looking at Dooley. And I said, being a good Georgian, and I do not like UGA, and I know they're playing this afternoon. And I said, I wonder if Vince Dooley is related to Dooley. The answer to that question is yes, it is. And he was a great supporter of the South Carolina Battleground Preservation Trust, who did some work on the park over there. So there is a connection there.
I always take this slot, this time slot, because it's just before lunch and everybody's hungry.
Well, we are. That is very true. And with that, I would like to ask, we had a volunteer for who? Oh, Reverend Long. Devin, will you mind saying grace for us, please, sir?
I do not.
Thank you.
Father, we thank you for this time that we've shared, that we are sharing together. We thank you for the meal that has been prepared, that we shall share together. We thank you for all that we are learning in here and for this momentous occasion. We ask that you bless these moments of fellowship, those who have prepared the food, bless them and bless us as we receive them. We thank you for it in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Okay, so we're going to have lunch, and then about